This is a quick video on tips and tricks for making grid tiles. There are a couple things to keep in mind when you're making these guys. This is a pretty small one. This is actually one of the first ones that I ever made. And there's a couple things that I get asked about, and there's some common things that you can do to ensure that your grid tiles will come out consistent and great looking. So I'm going to keep using the jig that I made on my original video 2.5 years ago. It's still going well. I had to repair it a little bit, but other than that, you can see that it's gotten a little bit of wear here from me holding it. It's actually indented now, but it still works great. And this is the original square that I made on my videos as well. Here you can see my handwritten version on the back. I just glued this on there so it looked a little nicer. So there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. First, for the basics, everything comes down to this jig at the end of the day. This jig needs to be pretty consistent, and the way to test this is it has to have little to no play with your grid square template. I'm sorry, with your square template here on each one, in between each one of the ribs. So you can see mine, it doesn't fall out or anything, it just sort of it hugs it slightly. And you want to have that on both sides and in between each one. The other thing to keep in mind is cutting the squares. You're going to be cutting a lot of these little squares from this template. Now, the one thing always to keep in mind is you basically denote one dimension as your actual width that you're always going to use. In my case, it's this width right here, and I've noted it. You don't want to try to have two widths, like you don't want to put this down and draw here and draw there for your square, because odds are pretty good that they are not going to be the exact same width, even if they're very close to 1.5 inches. What's more important is that you use this same width to trace both sides of the square. That way that's going to be as even as possible, even if it is a little bit off from 1.5 inch. You also want to make sure that you always use the same side of your square, because what can happen is when you're cutting this foam piece out, you may hold your knife slightly on an angle. So this bottom edge might be a different width than the top edge. So you always want to make sure you use the same side of your tile. And that side that you're going to use goes down towards the foam. So what I do here is, first I'm going to cut out a strip of them here. And so I'm turning it sideways because I want to make sure I use this length. And there's two ways I can use to measure out the side of this. A mechanical pencil is good. You don't want to use a dull pencil because the thickness of this is going to throw you off a little bit. But you can use a mechanical pencil, just like this, and you just put it right up to the edge. Or you can also make your life a little easier even and just use the back side of the blade. With a gentle touch, you can just put it down and scrape across. And you are going to get a super accurate line right there for your cut. And you don't have to do this all the way across, because what we're going to do is we're going to use our metal ruler and lay that out and cut along that instead here. And what you want to do is you always want to do it in such a way that you can still see your line, and your line is butting up against the edge of the ruler. You don't want to be covering up your line, you want to be right up against it. So what this does is, since we've now used a very thin item to trace that line, like our blade or our mechanical pencil, the additional thickness that this line gives us is going to go away when we cut it, because it's going to be basically the same width as the blade. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is you want to have a nice 2 points of contact minimum on your ruler, and this goes for if you're going to do a long strip too. And you want to make sure you're holding your knife to the foam perpendicular. Right? So you want to make sure that it's going to be at 90 degrees to there. You also want to make sure that if you're looking at the foam, you're not cutting it like this, right? You're cutting it more like this. You're slicing, you're not ripping, you're slicing. And what happens with that is when you have an oblique angle like this, it's going to be a lot smoother to go through the foam, and it's going to have less of a chance to drag you off course. You also want to hold this like you would if you're cutting like something with a knife and fork. Or you can hold it like a pencil, like this. You don't want to have kind of a caveman grip like this. You always want to be able to guide it, keep it on track, and you're gonna have a light touch. There's no reason to white knuckle this. You really just need a light touch. And don't be afraid to do more than one pass. So, and that's usually what I do. So I'm gonna do a couple passes here. Oh, my blade is falling out of there. I must have put it in there wrong. There you go. So you can see a nice, smooth, even cut. And when you look at it on end, it's perpendicular, right? And that's gonna be really great for when we put these squares down. They're gonna lay on great, they're gonna adhere, they're gonna hold on to walls and connectors better, and you're just gonna have a nice looking tile. You're gonna do the same thing then also for the other direction where you're gonna cut out the individual tiles. Now remember, we're gonna use this width here. So I'm gonna put that, turn that down. And what I always try to do is, I always try to not rely on the fact that the end is square. So I'll usually kind of cut off a little bit of the end there. And then do that for the whole way down. And so on, right? And the same thing, I will use my ruler. And you will find that when you get better at this, you don't necessarily have to do this for everyone. I mean, I kind of eyeball these now. But if you're just starting out, you're probably going to want to do this with the ruler. I got to fix that in a second. But yeah, so you can see you get a nice even square, and they are the same width in both directions, right? If I had used this width here, you can see I would have been way off. That is why we always use the same width. Now, let's talk a little bit about knives. The lowly utility knife. I know it gets a bad rap. I know there's folks out there who love their X-Actos, who love whatever utility knife or whatever knife they're using. And I have a couple very specific reasons for using this. One, as opposed to an X-Acto blade, this is a very wide cutting surface. So when you are trying to stay perpendicular, you have a lot visually to look at to make sure you're staying perpendicular. The other thing is, this is about the width of an X-Acto knife handle. It's a lot harder to keep something this small perpendicular when you're cutting, right? So if you have something big to hold and to look at, it's a lot easier to see where that plane of perpendicularness is compared to the blade itself. With an X-Acto knife, it's symmetrical all the way around. You can't tell. And also, the X-Acto knife comes to such a narrow tip that any small variation will make it kind of go off course. So I highly recommend this. First of all, the blades are, I mean, they're 25% of the cost of X-Acto blades. You can get, 50 of them for no money. You can get the handle for nothing. I will say, this is one that I would love to be able to sell this to you through my affiliate store, but they don't make them anymore. But any utility knife that is lightweight and then has sort of this kind of thick meatiness to it is going to be really good for you. I do have one up there on my affiliate site now. It's in a pack of 3, and I specifically put it in a pack of 3 because I find that life stops when I can't find my utility knife. So the investment in a couple more is welcome, and I think you will be very happy you did that. So let's talk about putting the squares onto the grid. I noticed a lot of folks I've been looking at people talking in our Discord channel. By the way, if you're not there, you should be there. It's a great place for Terrainoers to go and talk with other people, get some great advice. There's a lot of innovation going on there. There's some cool stuff in relation to cutting tiles that's being experimented with there, sort of mass production techniques. And once that kind of gets hammered out and I get to test it, you can expect a video on that as well. But what I've noticed is a lot of people, what they're doing is, let's say this is your Terraino board, right? This is your piece of foam that you're putting stuff on. People they're starting in the corner and putting their squares on like this. Not a good idea, because there's a couple of problems with this. One, when you're putting the squares on this way, you can only ever use the jig in this direction to confirm that they're spaced correctly. But there's nothing to use, there's no other squares that you can use to anchor onto to confirm the position of these squares in this direction. So what happens is, you may be perfectly accurate in this dimension, but this dimension you may be off by a lot. So what you have to do is, the right way to do this, and this is why, if you notice in the tutorial for the crown tile, I start in the middle. Basically, you want to do the spiraling pattern out from the middle. What this guarantees is, as you're laying squares, like you lay one here, you lay one here, you lay one here, and lay one here, you are in a position that you can confirm the position of everything except the first tile in both dimensions. So what happens is, that way you have the same amount of drift in each dimension. So when your board comes out, it should theoretically be within tight tolerances and be more or less the same width for the same amount of squares as it is height for the same amount of squares. So basically what, this is the one that I made years ago, and I think it still fits. Yep, still fits. And it fits in both directions, and it fits across the entire tile, because as I was laying this out, like let's say I started here, I laid this out, I put that tile in there, and then I put this one on there, and then I put this one on there, right? So now the minute I got that one on there, now I can confirm this tile and these 3 tiles in this dimension too, right? And when I put this one on, I can confirm it in this direction and this direction. And that's really, really important, especially because even, 1/100th of an inch, if you're doing this out to dozens of tiles, you're already, you could be at a 10th of an inch by the time you're done. And adding that to maybe your inconsistencies in the width of the squares themselves, that can add up a lot. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind a spiral pattern from the middle, okay? And always checking your squares in both dimensions with your jig. And before all that, just making sure that your jig is good and has good tolerances, where you can basically put your template for the square in there, and it'll kind of hang on there but come out easily. Okay, and those, let me talk a little bit about the ribs and stuff here too. You also want to make sure, this goes back to the good knife techniques, you want to make sure that when you're cutting these ribs and the spine, that you're perpendicular to the foam, just like you are when you're cutting out the individual squares. That's pretty much it. If I have more advice for you, I'm going to make more videos, but I wanted to get this out there. And if you have any questions, hit me up on Discord. It's the Terraino Discord channel. I don't know exactly the name of it, but I will leave a link to that underneath this video. All right, thanks, and happy crafting.
Please like and subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified of new videos. If you'd like to support future videos and get the inside track on Terraino development, consider becoming a GameGearMaster member at patreon.com/GameGearMaster. And don't forget to download your free Terraino Basics construction manual at GameGearMaster.com.